Hey everybody, Tony D, and I'd like to do some screenwriting tips. And this is about the old adage, too many cooks spoil the stew. And the reason I was reminded of it, Art Vader made a comment about I Am Legend and the fact that they at one point were developing that Will Smith movie with Arnold Schwarzenegger as the lead, but it didn't happen. And obviously it would have been a very different movie. I was reminded then of how I Am Legend was one of these fairly earlier movies that got recut and recut. They had different endings. And then I was thinking about how now they're budgeting reshoots into movies like the Justice League, right? They showed it to some focus groups, didn't test well enough for them. They went back and they reshot a portion of the movie. They did that with Aquaman. And I've said before, I think that can take a really terrible movie and bring it to a semi-acceptable level. But I think it can turn a great movie into something terrible. Because when you look at a movie like Blazing Saddles, they showed it to the focus group, and I believe they had a focus group at that time. They showed it to the execs, and the execs said, "Oh, well, we got a lot of changes for you. We love the movie, but you got to change a bunch of things." And Mel ignored it, and the movie was a huge hit, and it's one of the greatest comedies you'll ever see if you haven't seen Blazing Saddles. So I think, there are too many people in the movie industry that think, again, that they're making a can of peas. Making movies can be a complicated thing, but because it's complicated to a degree, it's very easy to overcomplicate it to the point at which nobody knows what anybody's doing. Let me see if I can make an analogy that makes sense. I always say that making a movie is like building a house. The screenwriter is like the architect. He makes the plans for good foundation, and then if everybody follows those plans, you have a strong foundation, a strong house, and the director and the actors can put the touches on it, and the various people who do the pragmatic things are like the electricians and the plumbers and stuff like that. The problem is when you're making a movie and everybody's fighting to get their creative stuff in the movie, that really shouldn't happen. A good producer and good director will keep people in their lane. I've worked on movies in which, I've had very indecisive producers who allowed almost anybody to throw out a suggestion and change the screenplay, change a shot, change the way an actor delivered a line, added lines. If you are a strong person as a director, you can sometimes allow some of that in and say, well, that's a good idea, we'll use that line or whatever. Or that's a good take, do it that way. But it can easily get too much. And when it becomes too much, the screenplay starts to unravel. So it would be like you start building the house and the electrician says, well, I'd really like to add some more outlets in the bathroom because I think people need them, without consulting, say, the screenwriter or the architect. And so he just adds them. And the foreman building the house goes, yeah, go ahead. And then that messes up the plumber because pipes had to go near there and he has to move the pipes further out. And then the plumber says, well, if he's going to add all those extra plugs, well, I'd like to add a second toilet. And then the indecisive foreman says, sure, add a toilet. That sounds great. Add a whole bathroom. And the next thing you know, people are just adding stuff that don't really make sense with the house. They start forgetting about the structure, which is the most important thing. And they just want to be able to say, well, I added an extra bathroom for you at no extra cost. Well, I added extra outlets over here, or I added an extra window, or I added this or that. That's kind of the way it happens in my view, a lot of bad movies. I'm the guy who put the nipples on the bat Man costume. I'm the guy who came up with the idea for Baby Yoda, or this or that. Now, again, it doesn't mean some ideas can't be good, or some ideas can't be incorporated in a good way. I was just watching Year of the Rabbit, which if you haven't seen, is pretty good. And in the first episode, they introduce a character who's a pretty woke character, right? She is the adopted daughter of a police sergeant, but the show takes place in the late 1800s, like in the Victorian age in London. And she's black. So it's highly unlikely a character like that would be in such a position as she is in the show. I mean, she is obviously there to be like the female woman of color who's empowered. And but they managed to script it in such a way that it works. Even though it's kind of unrealistic, it doesn't take away from the show and the characters too much. She is the sensible one. And you always need in a comedy the sensible character. So they managed to work it in. But in a lot of other instances, it just gets hammered in, and because, hey, we got to add wokeness because maybe the producer is worried, maybe, they don't want to hear the studio say something like, well, you got to add a woman of color or else nobody will watch this thing, because that's the way people are right now. Or, it's a studio head that's super woke and just demands all this nonsense. You may have to add that stuff. And if you work with the people who write and direct and act, you can sometimes make that work, and it's almost seamless. In Year of the Rabbit, it didn't bother me. It didn't bother me that this character was a little unrealistic. She was fine. She popped in, she had a couple of good lines, and she didn't overburden the show with interracial feminism or anything like that. So, you can work it out. But a lot of times, if you're working in a condition where the producer or the director or both just won't put their foot down and say, well, you're the writer, so we're going to go with your ideas, or, a mixture of yours and my ideas. I had a producer, he wasn't really my producer, but I was trying to work for him, and he told me that he and a writer went down to the boardwalk and spent the weekend, at the Jersey Shore and supposedly writing a screenplay. And I said, well, how did that go? And his response was, well, we went for walks on the boardwalk and we asked people what they thought about this scene or that scene. And I just thought, what? Why? What are you, taking a survey? That's not how you write a screenplay. You don't run around asking people for their opinions. That's the same problem I have with focus groups, right? It's like the focus group's not supposed to make the movie. You are. You can ask people over and over again, well, what do you like? Will you see this movie? Well, what can I put in it so you'll see it? But you might as well just beg them for money, because it's a little more direct and they'll probably get the message sooner. Movies and entertainment are about making something. And if you are so devoid of ideas, you need to ask random strangers on the street, what do you like? Well, obviously you're the wrong person to be in the movie industry. You should be out of the industry, or you should stay in your lane and just raise the damn money and let people with talent write, direct, act, and do what they do. So if you're ever in a position like this, it's very difficult. There's only so much you can do. You can maybe pull the director or producer aside and say, hey, listen, we can't have everybody throwing in their opinions in this. And typically the reaction, in one instance, I was kind of forced to write with another guy. He wasn't really a writer. He was considered a consultant on the movie. And we sat down, and the guy was like, oh, well, there are no egos here. We would be buddies. And I thought at first, oh, okay, well, this is fine then. He's just going to make a few suggestions and we'll be on our way. So he pitched this scene, and it was insane. We didn't have the money for it. It was pretty crazy, and it wasn't why he was consulted. Like, he was consulted for a specific thing of his expertise, but he was really pitching a scene that involved things that had nothing to do with his expertise. It was just stuff he thought was cool. And I tried to explain to him, well, I don't think we have the budget for that, and I don't think it'll work because of this and that. And we were maybe like, I don't know, 15 minutes into our first sit down, and he just exploded and started screaming at me. I think I did a digital hobo about it on the Webcomic Factory. And he just lost his mind. He started screaming at me, you hate all my ideas, who the hell do you think you are? And that's, unfortunately, how some people are about their ideas, you know? You have to understand who's, you know, where the creative hierarchy is. In the creative hierarchy on a movie, director is numero uno, all right? He's number one. Now, the producer is technically above him, but he's above him for more pragmatic concerns. Money, people, resources, that kind of thing. So he does have influence. Does he get to have creative input? Yeah, sometimes he does, simply by the dint of the fact that, well, it's his money. But really, it's the director who should be the final arbiter of a lot of things. Maybe the producer gets final cut, but really, it should be the director. And beyond that, the next person on the totem pole should probably be the screenwriter in terms of what actually happens in the story. It starts to get specialized from there. The screenwriter is really in charge of the writing, the dialogue, crucial stuff. Now, obviously, the actors are going to have some input, and they're going to change a couple of words here and there, but we can't let them go completely off the reservation. You can't let them change the character so completely it ruins the story. You have to keep them within the lane. Yeah, and obviously the cinematographer might have a few things to say about how it's shot or how an important moment in the movie is revealed. The screenwriter makes suggestions, and then, you know, the director and the cinematographer work together to make that happen, but they may have a better idea, which is fine, and that ultimate control always lies with the director. You know, but if you have a strong-willed cinematographer who's bossing the director around, you have an imbalance in the hierarchy that could lead to ruin. Same thing with some of the actors. If you have an actor, he's super famous, and he's not really working with you, it's a problem. It's a problem. I've heard stories about big-time actors who, you know, they get with a new director and they big-time them. They say, I'm a big Hollywood guy. You listen to me. I don't want to name any names. But, you know, it's happened. And that could be a problem, because if you have a story and a script you're trying to follow and the actor just wants to go off the rails and rant about whatever, you know, it may be a perfectly fine scene by itself, but it may not integrate well into the movie. You know, you have to look at the movie as a whole. And that's why it's very important to listen to the screenwriter, because the screenwriter always looks at it as a whole. He always looks at it as a screenplay from beginning to end. The pacing, really, is a lot of that is created by the screenwriter, and then, you know, it is made happen by the director's, the way he shoots it. So creatively, the three main guys are the director at the top and the screenwriter and the cinematographer. Maybe the lead actor throws in his 2 cents, but he should not be in the management meetings. He should be managed. It's fine for him to throw a few lines of dialogue or whatever he has an idea for. That's all fine. That stuff, you know, if you're shooting extra and you're way ahead, that's fine too. You know, shoot extra scenes. I've seen directors do that. But you have to at least stick to the script, because once you've committed to your pre-production and you're committed to a timetable to shoot this thing, you don't want to keep going off the reservation, because that messes you up. I worked on a movie where, man, they got to the editing room and they literally hadn't shot half the scenes. You know, like 25% of the movie. Easily, they just didn't shoot it. They had to go back with a second unit and shoot a whole bunch of stuff. And really, it was the editor that saved that movie, you know, to make it a coherent narrative. you know, because he looked at my screenplay and it's like, they didn't shoot half the scenes, and that was unfortunately the fault, I believe, of the director. I wasn't there, so I'm not trying to. But when you're dealing with this, you have to sort of respect that hierarchy. Now, as a screenwriter, it's really tough because they will marginalize you at almost every turn. If you're not on the set, and a lot of times, you know, we're low budget stuff, you're not going to be on the set unless you're also the director, or you're also the cinematographer, you're also one of the actors, or producer or whatever. You may not have that kind of time to invest. You may not be getting paid, so you may not be able to do it. I couldn't do it. You know, the movies they shot of mine, I couldn't do it. I didn't have the time, and I wasn't in them. I was in one version of one of the movies, but that never sees the light of day now. So if you got too many cooks and you're spoiling the stew, you could try to steer it away from that. You could try to make the director and the producer stronger, but it's tough. If they're weak, you're probably in for a bad time. You're probably in for a bad time of indecisiveness and everybody throwing their 2 cents in. Everybody thinks they can write. Everybody thinks, oh, I got a good idea for a joke. Why don't you say this? Yeah, don't, you know, you got to try to shut those guys out unless they, you know, I mean, you could listen to them, you could hear them out, but at the end of the day, you, the director, the producer, you make the decisions, maybe the cinematographer, maybe one of the lead actors. At the end of the day, you know, respect the hierarchy if you're a young filmmaker. And if you're a young director, damn it, you better be in charge. There's only one guy you got to listen to, and that's the producer when he says, we're out of money, you can't do that. That's the only guy. That's the only guy who can stop you. Everybody else has to listen to you. They have to. If they're not listening to you, you have to pull them aside and go, listen, I'm the director. You have to listen to me. I'm making the decisions here. I'm the one who gets credit or gets infamy from this movie. So you have to listen to me. I would appreciate if you didn't undermine me on the set. And if you have things to say, I will respectfully listen at an appropriate time. But we're on the set and maybe it's too late, we're running behind or whatever. You got to listen to me because we have to follow the screenplay so it makes sense. Okay? Anyhow, that's my screenwriting and movie making tip for today.